Thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. My task, I guess, in the next 15 minutes is to set the scene for the speakers that follows. I'd just like to outline the projects that we are delivering at the moment in the Saâne and the Otter Valleys. Now, the actual delivery of these schemes is really important, and you'll get some insights into what's happening on the ground. But equally important is the kind of learning that we hope that these projects are generating, that we hope that will help other coastal communities look at the issues they challenge them, and hopefully assist them to find some of the solutions. So just for those that don't know about the scheme, the acronym of our project is called PACCo, and that stands for Promoting Adaptation to Changing Coasts. And really it's all about trying to work with local communities and various other stakeholders and turn the problems caused by climate change and turn them into positive benefits and positive solutions. So that's what it's all about, and it's 26 million euros, and 17.8 comes from the European Regional Development Fund through Interreg. Now, we know, why is this project important? Well, we know climate change is happening, and we can all see it on our coast, and a couple of images here to represent that. There's the top images from Exmouth that some of you may know, and there's some big, suffers historically from flooding, and there's a big flood defence scheme that's been delivered there at the moment. The bottom picture shows the Otter Valley, which is heavily modified by human hand, and you can see it after with the tide in, and that's this area around here, but also it's full up of water from a sort of a fluvial, so after heavy rainfall, and this embankment that was built several hundred years ago is starting to fail and eroding, and as sea levels rise, we would expect this embankment to catastrophically breach. So these problems are real. We have what we're trying to show really with this scheme is that climate change is real, it's happening, and it's impacting hard on coastal communities, but actually it is possible to adapt. It's not easy, but it's possible, and actually acting faster, adapting earlier is far better than burying your head in the sand and waiting and doing it later. So those are the kind of three key messages. Becky alluded to the sites, but there's lots of information on our various project websites, which you can go to find out more about the individual schemes. And over the course of the coming months, a lot of the learning coming from this scheme will be put in the public domain, particularly at the top website, the PACCo Interreg, and can be downloaded. There's various partners in the scheme. There's the Environment Agency, it's the lead. You've got the Conservatoire du Littoral that promotes sustainable management of coastlines in France. Our Pebblebed Heaths Conservation Trust, who I work for, and we manage the Lower Otter Valley. You've got the Terroir du Corps in Normandy, which is a sort of a grouping, I suppose, of municipalities. You've got DEFRA, and you've got the commune de Quiberville, which is a sort of town of Quiberville that's situated at the mouth of the Saâne Valley. In terms of our project sites, you can see where they are here. One in Normandy, so just sort of south of Dieppe, I suppose, and then the Otter Valley in Devon. And they're quite similar in characteristics. They are relatively narrow valleys. They've been heavily modified in various ways through the building of roads. They have various recreational facilities that have been built over time in them, such as campsites and a cricket club in Devon. You've got other sort of issues like old refuge dumps in the middle of the floodplain. You have, in the case of the Saâne Valley, you have issues to do with sewage infrastructure. You have eroding paths and so on. And over time, a lot of the original habitat that was there has been lost. So there are some very real issues, and you can get a sense of those here. That bottom left picture shows sort of Keeperville and associated campsite after some heavy flooding. And quite often these valleys, and I think it's true for both, they're not able to naturally drain as they once did. And on the Otter Valley, you've got some pictures there that shows you the top left is was 2018, I think, where a flood embankment was within one tidal cycle of catastrophically breaching, and it was only at a lot of expense of public funding that was shorn up. You can the top right just shows a road that's been flooded through after a heavy rainfall. In the Otter Valley, that's the cricket club in the middle bottom after some heavy rainfall. And when it rains, everything behind in that valley, it just can't, the floodplain is disconnected from the river and it can't drain out to sea. And that picture right just shows you a digger trying to dig out the only outfall, the only way that the valley can drain out to sea. So what are we actually doing? So before talking about the learning, where are we at with these schemes, the actual delivery of them? So firstly, on the Otter Valley, the left-hand side picture shows a schematic of what it is we're trying to do. So number 9, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, which is here, is right. So this is the sea over here and the Otter Valley runs this way. So we are going to breach the existing flood embankment. This was an embankment that was built several hundred years ago to reclaim much of the original area of intertidal habitat, so salt marsh and mudflat for agriculture. We're going to breach it here and allow the sea to come up on both sides of the embankment. So this is the final small area of intertidal habitat that is still left. So we're going to let the sea on both sides, because we know that this embankment will breach in the future. So the sea is coming up this valley, whether we like it or not. Over here, you can see the design for the new creek network ready to accept the sea, because drainage is critically important. And you can see how that has already been dug to a great extent already. So that's really good progress. When the water comes up, the sea comes up this area, it needs to flow up the valley. There is a road that it currently runs across the valley, which is very low lying. If we did nothing to that road, it would become tidal on 80% of high tides. So this road, and there's you can't see it off the picture, but there's a community that lives on the other side of the valley, and there are various business units. They would be, the access would be difficult. And so this road is being raised and moved slightly. So it will be free from flooding into the future. Currently, it floods on after kind of fluvial events. Number 5 here, this is a new 30-meter road bridge that will allow the water to come up the floodplain and then further up the valley. So that's the number 5 there. I talked about having a tip before. So we have many unfortunate things in our floodplains, and many of our valleys actually have old municipal dumps. And I think there was a report that came out about that and their impact and fairly recently. In an ideal world, of course, I mean, this tip operated for about 50 years, between 1928 and 1978, I think, there or thereabouts. In an ideal world, we would be removing it in its entirety, but the cost of doing that would be astronomical. So the best we can do is to make sure it is properly capped, which it wasn't before, and it is protected from flooding. So that's a big part of the scheme. And then going further up the valley, this used to be sort of agricultural land. Again, we've dug the creek network ready to receive the sea when it comes up to about here, number 3 on this map, which you can just see where the embankment kind of curves across the floodplain. So all neap tides will go up to this height, and then spring tides will come up a little bit a little bit higher up to this area here. And in the next slide, so what would that look like once this project is done? Well, it would turn essentially a pastoral landscape into back to closer to what it was several hundred years ago, which is intertidal in nature, with lots of mud flats and salt marsh, and that green is the existing tip. So it's really quite an exciting restoration scheme, and some of the biggest landscape scale change we've probably seen in East Devon for a very long time. There's a lot of really good work that's happening on the Saâne Valley as well. They don't have a cricket club, of course, but they do have a very important tourism centre, a campsite, which floods on a regular basis. And these two photographs at the bottom show the early stages of moving the campsite. It's been redeveloped into a much better facility with up to 500 visitors, and there's a lot of really good emphasis on sort of upgrading it, making sure that sustainable transport and green sort of infrastructure is improved. And a lot of the the campsite and tourism is an incredibly large part of local tourism. I mentioned also before about that there are issues with sanitation in the valley, which has impacts on water quality and wildlife. And another part of their scheme is actually developing a new sort of waste water treatment plant in Longueuil, which is it's a big bit of work actually. So it's probably 24 kilometers of piping is going to be built, and it's taking a lot of houses off sort of septic tanks, which are faulty, and putting them into a kind of collective sewage network. So that is also a really exciting part of their scheme. And both of us, like ourselves in the Otter and in the Saâne Valley, there's a lot of sort of emphasis on trying to make this scheme work for nature as well, to try and allow natural processes to reassert themselves, to try and create new habitat and just improve the water quality and the environment and so on. And that's a sort of a kind of artist's impression of how it might look in the future. Neither of these schemes are perfect, but they are probably as good as best of compromise as we're able to get. Now, to move on to sort of what our speaker is going to talk about, one of the way that we have a work package which essentially deals with the socio-economic part of the scheme. So one part of this, which Roger will be talking about, is a sort of methodology for engagement. Now, we know that these kinds of schemes are hard to deliver. They're hard, they can be hard technically to deliver, they can be hard to finance, but also it can be difficult to bring society along with you and to have that support that you need from stakeholders. And this kind of picture represents, on the top left, you've got the kind of the Otter Valley as it is now, and the one below as it might be at low tide. This is a lot of change. There is a lot of, it's a beautiful valley already. And when you suggest schemes like this, there is understandably a lot of concern about what that might mean for the valley, how it will change. People are hefted to it. They love it. It's the kind of landscape they've known for generations, and that is being changed. Likewise, when you're dealing with climate change, it's quite hard sometimes to know about the certainties and what if you do this, what does this mean for flooding? So, as you might expect, this scheme has done its best to consult and engage as we've gone along. So it's taken 10 years to develop. But it has been, I would say, a bumpy ride at times. And not everybody is supportive of it. Some people still aren't. And for sure, I think we although we did our best, we've made some mistakes. And you can see the kind of the level of in terms of the community view being split. So when it came to the planning application, we had about 240 objections to it and about 295 in support. So what we were quite excited about, and this just shows some of the sort of, you can see the strength of feeling in some of the graffiti on our signs. Now, this is a great opportunity to take what we've done, and we were very keen to ask Exeter University to come in and basically scrutinize what we did, who do we engage with, how do we do it, what was the representation like, what do we say, how do we say it, and to kind of critique that with a view to coming up with recommendations for how future projects might go about it differently, and actually learn from the lessons the mistakes that we've made, and this kind of move from this sort of, historically, I guess, schemes like this would have been done for a sort of, you decide it, you announce it, and you defend it against anybody that doesn't like it, and more to this sort of engaging, deliberating, deciding model that is preferable. But I'll allow Roger to talk about his work in more detail. So that's a really exciting bit of learning, and this learning will be in the public domain, and it will be on our website hopefully in a month or so. And it will all. The second bit, final bit of sort of introduction really is for Susi, is one of the things we're very keen to understand is how do you kind of value the benefits of these schemes, both the benefits, but also the disbenefits, because there are some things that you might lose. And the approach we've taken is one of looking at natural capital, i.e. looking at the sort of natural assets that provide a range of services for society, whether it's production of food or timber, whether it's climate regulation, carbon storage, or whether it's just sort of aesthetic landscapes or opportunities for recreation. So that's the kind of approach we've taken for this. And in some broad terms, you look at what your natural asset might be. Let's say it's a woodland, for example. Now, we know that woodlands have many functions. So it might slow the flow of water, say, if you have a woodland on a hill, on a slope. That has a service to us, which is flood protection of houses, maybe, if you have a community that's down slope. And then there's a kind of benefit, a financial benefit. Now, the issue with natural capital valuations is that you can only, it's one lens. It doesn't give you the whole answer, but it's one lens through which to look at schemes and kind of try and assess the pros and cons of them. This is quite a nice little image, and I should say that thanks to Natural Capital Solutions for allowing us to show this particular slide. But if you look at the bottom of that triangle, there's a full range of benefits that we get from nature. And now we don't know what all of those are yet. However, some of these benefits we kind of do know. Yeah, and we can kind of make almost like a qualitative assessment of, if you do this, then such and such a service will improve, or you might if you do X, for example, your food production may go down. However, your flood storage may go up. Now, and some of these things you can then kind of quantify to some degree, and at the very top, some of them you may be able to put a monetary value on. So this is the approach we've taken looking at the schemes. Now, for an example, if you're doing a qualitative study, this isn't actually taken from our particular scheme, but it just shows that you can look at the various provisioning, regulating, cultural services, and just sort of assign a kind of, well, what's this site doing for food? What's it doing for, what kind of pollinating services is it providing? What's the biodiversity like? And then if you change that landscape, how do these elements change over time? And we're a very simple scoring system. So that's the kind of, the basic thing that you can do. And then you can go on and go into more and more detail. And Susi will kind of talk a little bit about that. Now, I think, and you can depict this sort of analysis in quite a nice sort of graph to show how things change depending on what you do with a landscape. Now I'm going to stop there, so hopefully that gives a bit of background to the scheme, and I'm going to ask Roger to maybe talk about the methodology and the engagement element of his work. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my...
Thank you, Sam.
We're getting some thumbs up from the audience. Thank you, Regis. So that was a thumbs up for Sam, and yeah, over to Roger. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see the slides okay. Yeah, so my name is Roger. I'm here to talk today about the element of the work package that Sam mentioned, which is the model for engagement of communities and stakeholders in coastal adaptation and landscape change. I have included some French translation in these slides. Apologies to our French speakers if there's any strange translation. I hope it's okay. Before I talk about the actual work, I'm just going to very briefly explain the background. So who am I? I am an environmental social scientist from the University of Exeter. And together with a research team, we have been independent researchers commissioned to undertake this package. There are 4 of us from the University of Exeter. That includes Professor Stuart Barr, who is here today, and might field some of the questions in the chat or at the end. And we've overseen the kind of delivery of this work package, I suppose, and the undertaking of data collection and interpretation from the Lower Otter Restoration Project side of things. But we've also been working with LISTO Consultancy. These are specialists in participatory processes, and they're based in Montpellier. And they've been really helpful in helping us to gather data and interpret results from the Saâne territorial project as well. And I'll give a particular thank you there to Marina Gentle as well from the consultancy, who's done some very good work for us. The aims of this work package are threefold, I suppose. The first of these was to independently evaluate the engagement process that was undertaken at both project sites. Just as a bit of clarity here, I'm talking about the engagement process during the development of the project. So that's from the point of kind of initial concept and idea through to obtaining planning permission. Things that have happened since the implementation and the future are kind of beyond the scope of where this evaluation goes, although there are some points that relate to that too. Our focus is on that development phase. We also need to capture the voices and views of communities, community members and stakeholders, those who've been involved, and capture their experiences here. And then to draw on everything, all that learning to develop this transferable model for engagement. So helpful lessons for future projects to consider learning from these 2 project sites. I will talk about the model itself in a moment, just as a brief bit of background for the research methods that underpin it, however, the research that we did. Undertook a work package of multiple methods, and we reported on them within 2 reports, which Sam mentioned should be available very soon. The first of these reports focuses on a document analyses. So this is where we have looked through about a decade's worth of documentation from both these projects and built together an outline of the engagement process that was undertaken. We've evaluated them against 4 criteria drawn from pre-existing literature. And what we've also done in that first report is to analyse the planning consultation responses that were received for the Lower Otter Restoration Project. For those who are in France, in the UK, as part of the planning regulations, there is a period where plans are put forward and are open for the public to provide some comments. And it's those that we were able to analyse here. That is different in France, so we didn't have that sort of documentation from France. So this is something additional we could do for the Lower Otter. Second report, this is where we talk about the research that we did where we actually engaged with some participants. And there were 2 things primarily that we did. The first of those is that at both project sites, we ran a series of workshops engaging with local residents to really understand their experiences, provide them an opportunity to have a voice as well. And then we also undertook a series of interviews with stakeholder representatives. Who I mean by that were people who've been involved in the development of the project or sat on a steering group for it, or other representatives of stakeholder groups that we identified during the document analysis process. Ultimately, the findings of all of those have been brought together into the model, which is also presented in that second report. as we mentioned, those will be available really soon. Today, I'm just going to outline the kind of final model components, those transferable lessons for other projects. But I do recommend looking at these reports when they become available, as it's there that we really outline the research methods, provide the evidence that includes quotes. So that'll be, and that's where people, the participants' voices are captured and made available. And there's further findings and practical recommendations that will be available within them. They are quite meaty reads, I suppose, but there'll be a short summary document to come to. Today, I'm going to talk about the model itself, and I'm going to do this by building up a diagram, a visualization, to explain the various components and the findings that we've gathered from this. So ultimately, what we're hoping to aim for is this optimal approach to engagement that involves both communities and stakeholders. That's going to be represented at the center of the diagram by this purple bubble. You can see here that there is a number in the bubble. There's a French translation provided to the side. Just for trying to fit everything on the slide, the English is inside the diagram, the French will be to the sides, and the corresponding number is where you can identify the translation. Other than that, the numbers have no meaning. They're just for translation purposes. So the first thing about this, first thing to bring into this model is that we identified 5 theoretical values to work towards in the engagement approach. So these are I suppose, the philosophical principles that we hope to incorporate within this optimal approach to engagement. I'll talk through them one by one. As I say, the numbers don't mean anything, so it might not be in the order of the numbers, but I'll explain each bit. And ultimately, the optimal approach is one that meets all of these theoretical values. First of these is empowerment. So change on a landscape scale such as this is going to interact with multiple stakeholder interests. It's particularly the case in public accessible areas. So, for example, with the Lower Otter, there's a network of well-used footpaths, so people really have been able to access and engage with the landscape and get to know it and associate with it. So ideally, an engagement approach would like to empower stakeholders and communities, particularly those who may be most affected. And in the workshops that we ran, the participants demonstrated that they really cared for their local landscape, and they all had different things that they valued within them. But they were all indicated they would be ready to engage in a process such as this. So empowered is one that's going to involve recognizing and understanding the different knowledge that those sorts of people could contribute. They're going beyond the kind of traditional consulting with the experts. So this may include, for example, knowledge gained through experience. So we had residents, for example, who had experienced flooding in the local area, so they could bring their own knowledge of and observations of how water has moved through the landscape and what they've experienced. All of those other things about other aspects that are valued by local people that would like to be good to kind of understand and appreciate within the development of these plans. This also involves an openness to feedback. So being able to hear those different voices and empathize with them, potentially leading to changes in design. There was some discussion about whether things were received as a single option proposal for comment, rather than something that they could meaningfully contribute towards. So there's an element of kind of being able to provide an outreach that might be able to lead to changes in design where it might be appropriate. Do that, it could be, yes, and then the next bit that is kind of hand in hand with that, but is slightly different to the how with more about the who, is representation. So given these interactions with multiple interests, the engaged parties along the way should encompass a spectrum of views. Exactly who is going to be engaged in this will depend on the location. So things such as like the different land uses or social dynamics in the area. But it will probably likely include political or statutory bodies or landowners, stakeholders and landscape users. But also should include some local community representatives too. So it can include groups within the community that may not feel represented by the official representative that has already been invited. So, for example, in the Lower Otter project, there was involvement early on with local elected representatives. So in the early stakeholder meetings, in 2016, there was an extension of the stakeholder group and other groups were brought in within there. There was one particular group who live along a road that is adjacent to the project site. And in the earlier stages, they felt they hadn't been represented. So when there was initial outreach with them, there was a bit of tension observed. So in 2016, they were invited to nominate their own representative who would represent residents on that road on the stakeholder group. So I mentioned stakeholder groups. There was a steering group for the Lower Otter project. The Saâne project had one too, COPIL. And the interview participants indicated that well-run groups that allow people to kind of feel they can express their voice and be heard are likely to be positively received by the participating members. But there's also room for wider public engagement to try and provide opportunities for other people who haven't been within those groups to engage. It might yield you new information, or it might highlight as yet unrepresented groups to invite to take part. Priority and accessibility I'll go for next. So someone on the top left. So landscape scale change is likely to address multiple objectives at once. It's going to have lots of things going on. So in the Lower Otter, for example, there was salt marsh recreation, a raising of a road, relocating a cricket pitch. Both projects have a breach of a sea defence. The Saâne's also got waterworks being built or campsite relocated. And there's also the relationship in the fact that these two projects do have a relationship, and all this sort of things add together to create some complexity. And complexity can be hard to communicate or for people to kind of understand and visualize. Some ways that were suggested by workshop participants that could help people to understand the project. There's one example could be considering investment in engagement specialists to facilitate two-way transfer information. There are comments about using clear information and refraining from technical language. I hope I'm not using too much of that today, but hopefully language that's easy to understand. Suggestions of using creative methods to visualize the proposal. Interestingly, both the Lower Otter and Saâne resident workshops, they were one of the recommendations made was to have a 3D physical model so that people could really connect with and visualize what changes are being proposed, maybe even to the point of running water through that so they can see where the water might flow. Also within this is an element of making information available through multiple communication routes so that it can reach as many people as possible. This includes both methods on and offline, because for some people, they might want to engage a lot through things like social media. For others, they might not have internet at all. So for them to be able to access information, it will need to be available on and offline. For uncertainties to work with here, adaptation is involving actions that address future circumstances. Although awareness or acceptance of climate change generally seems to be growing, there can still be disagreement between people about its impact or local level risk, which might lead people to question whether the actions proposed are the right ones to take. Our resident workshops, we had some suggestions that to try and coalesce and reach a more mutual understanding about this. There could be in the early stages, before introducing ideas for solution, discussion and engagement could open with discussion or education about local or global risk, hopefully reducing levels of uncertainty or at least instilling confidence in the proposed actions to take. Some might also disagree with hydrological modelling outputs if their understanding of how a landscape functions is different. I mentioned we had a group of residents that had observed how water flows through the landscape, and they had through experience seen how they view the water to drain. Their understanding of how the water flows, water might move deviated from what the modelling outputs would say, and so they wish to. So they didn't have as much trust in the models and therefore their kind of actions to undertake. So what they were hoping for is some direct engagement with those modelling specialists so that they could share, input their knowledge, but also to explore different scenarios. Therefore, perhaps leading to kind of increased confidence in those modelling outputs and hence in the actions proposed to undertake.
Roger?
Yes.
Becky here. May I ask you just to moderate the pace a little, please, for the interpreters? Thank you.
Of course, sorry. Yeah, of course, everything so far. So I just mentioned the word cost. That is the fifth of these theoretical values. So landscape change will involve acceptance of change in a landscape that people kind of live in and know, particularly when it's accessible, they really live and breathe that landscape. So trust with between project partners and those people is likely to increase the social acceptability of those changes. Trust will be influenced to some extent by the other theoretical values there. For example, if community members feel they've been involved in an inclusive manner and they're being listened to, there can be trust that comes from that. Or if there's clear and accessible information where people can understand the project motivations or why decisions have been taken, trust can be built there too. But this ultimately relates to an approach to engagement that is perceived to be transparent, is seen as honest, and is open as well. That's very likely to be well received. Trust can also possibly be influenced by pre-existing relationships or existing power dynamics. So, for example, if people have an association with the major landowner in the area that kind of pre-exists a project, that might influence the engagement process. If and where that is potentially an issue, one thing that could be considered, which was a proposal, is the recruitment of an independent engagement facilitator who could facilitate two-way dialogue and trust building there. Those are the 5 kind of core theoretical values. The next bit is a recognition of elements of the engagement process as it moves forward through time. So engagement as a process. These are represented in the diagram by an arrow as it's directional as you move through time. It starts with preparation. So it was suggested, particularly in interviews as well, to reflect on the local social context, assess whether there are pre-existing relationships to take account of. And it could be that there's also an influence of prior events to be prepared for. So, for example, over in the Saâne, there was a project proposal before the Saâne territorial project, the re-estuarization project. That didn't go ahead, but what that meant was there was some work to kind of clarify the relationship between the prior project and the Saâne project as things went forwards. And as we mentioned a moment ago, if there are things that could pose a challenge, perhaps consider allocating resources to independent facilitation if necessary. But then early engagement this is the really key one, I believe, is to get people involved early. Landscape change can be emotive, so that initial outreach will need to be quite sensitive. There were lots of things that we were being observed that people had value in the landscape. But that early engagement with opportunities to transfer knowledge about the issue is really key. And an element of this early engagement is also the fact that changes in designs might be more possible earlier in a development before a project kind of progresses and becomes more fixed. So to provide that sense of empowerment and the kind of feeling that they might be able to influence the proposal is more likely to be possible earlier. But then after that, there's sustained engagement. It is a committed process. It can take a long time, so it has to be kept up. With up-to-date and regular communications, which can refrain from leaving an information gap. There were things that some participants were uncertain of, and so therefore were sort of suspicious about certain things that are taking place. So I want to make sure the information is really out there regularly. You might recognise new voices that need to be brought into a process later, but it can be harder to engage with them later in the process because they might feel they've been less empowered so far. But it isn't too late. It's always worth trying to bring them in if you can. I gave the example earlier of the Residents' Road who reported later engagement to be better than that earlier on, having been invited to take part in the stakeholder group. So then engagement into the future. So I mentioned that we're looking at the development process, but there was interest from our participants in what is the future of the valley, or and how is management going to be there, what input they could have. So there's likely to be that interest in the future of the landscape once the plan has come together. So we highlight that there's a need to consider how to facilitate continued engagement, continued empowerment into the future there. Some examples and proposals given were for continued discussion about those management issues, or there was a proposal that you could perhaps empower local people to volunteer in the landscape, being perhaps as marshalling or to monitor change in the valleys. So there's sorts of things that could be considered going forwards as well. And then the last bit is a recognition that along the way, there are all these aspects of engaging, but they're all still going to have to negotiate a lot of external influences or challenges that might limit what's possible. So in this diagram, these are represented by arrows that move away from the central optimal approach, because these are the factors that can push and pull on engagement and might challenge the ability to get to that middle and meet all those factors. Examples of what these are, these particularly came through in the interviews with the stakeholders. So one is the regulatory frameworks. So legal requirements might place restrictions on the sorts of things that are possible. So if people propose ideas, it might not be something that allows a project to meet legal requirements, for example. There can be financial limitations. There might be a limitation for what funds could be allocated to engagement itself, or it might be that certain actions being proposed by those that are engaged aren't possible because there's no funder that might be able to fund those actions. Technical things. So again, similarly, as something might be proposed by somebody, but there might be a kind of, it might not be physically possible, which poses a limitation on how much creativity there can be. Organizational limitations too. One of these could be the available staff time to participate in meetings that might take time. There's also, we had some comments about changing personnel can make things difficult too. So in the Lower Otter, for example, there was a change in electoral cycle. So the local elected representatives changed partway through the project. And so there was some kind of discussions that had to start with the new person, despite it being further down the line there. So there's some challenges associated with that. Of course, unforeseen events or national circumstances too. So COVID-19 was a big one here. It might limit the amount of face-to-face engagement, for example, that's possible. So there can be unforeseen events that might need to be a challenge to overcome. Together, these are our proposed model for engagement. It is a committed process and it's unlikely to come without challenges. But ultimately, we hope it's a model that will lead to an approach that's inclusive of different types of knowledge. That can be daunting. It might mean having to evolve from previous ways of working. It might mean hearing views that might be discomforting or hard to hear. But we believe that the sort of sensitive engagement that meets these theoretical values is likely to save time and effort later. There'll be trust that is built and enable approaches to adaptation that meet both the environmental and social objectives too. So thank you very much. I'm just going to very quickly say a couple of thank yous. We have our colleagues at the University of Exeter who've been really fantastic to work with. Lissode as well for delivering the work in France for us, but especially Marina. Our research participants were fantastic. I think everybody who took part was really trusting, really contributing and took part really constructively. And without that, this just wouldn't be possible. So a huge thank you to them. And also thank you to the PACCo delivery partners, East Devon, Pebblebed, Heaths, the Environment Agency and Conservatoire de Littoral, because I can imagine it's probably quite daunting to have someone independent and come and review something that's been taking place, particularly over a long time. But I really feel our position as the independent researchers has been really respected and enabled this work to take place. So I'd like to say thank you to all of them too.
Thank you very much indeed, Roger. I can see there are kind of quite a few questions coming in, but what I suggest is that we move straight on to Susi, if you're ready, Susi, to talk about the protocol, and then I can see that the questions are getting collated as we go.
Okay, give me a second. I'm just trying to share my screen, but I can't find a presentation window at the moment. There it is. Got too many open. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes, that's great.
Great. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Thank you very much for having me today. My name's Susi Armstrong. I work for APBMer as a principal marine environmental consultant, and I am a nature-based solutions specialist. I call myself these days, especially managed realignment. And today I'd like to talk to you about the quantitative natural capital-based socio-economic assessment we've undertaken for LORP, the Lower Otter Restoration Project. We couldn't have done this without FTEC, who are an environmental economics consultancy in London, who have been brilliant, especially Rob Tinch and Ian Dickey, who worked on the project with us. And there was also some input from Portsmouth Uni on the survey element. So we started on this work back in 2021, when we basically set up a methods document, first of all. That was then followed, but after some review by all the sort of steering group members, by the development of a protocols document, which was finalized last September. That basically sets out how we would propose to do the assessment, as Sam has already outlined within the natural capital framework. And then we undertook the baseline evaluation of basically the as-is scenario, or before LORP scenario, early in the year, and we submitted the sort of final report for that in September. And now we're just finalizing the change report, basically, which is effectively the comparison of what would have been without LORP and with LORP. And there's some preliminary results in the slide there, but I won't go into that at the moment. We also undertook some user perception surveys, i.e. locals and visitors, of generally what they thought of this scheme, not the stakeholder consultation, which is what Exeter looked after. And we repeated that again this year, and some of that fed into the natural capital accounting, but not all that much. It's more of a standalone deliverable, really, the user surveys. So natural capital accounting then, what is it? Sam has already effectively told you what natural capital is and ecosystem services and the cascade. But with natural capital accounting, basically, we're trying to answer these key 5 questions. First of all, what assets do we have? How much of it? And what conditions are they in, the habitats, for example? Then what services, goods or benefits do they provide, and to whom? What are these benefits worth? Can we value them? Can we monetize them? And also, we also need to know, what does it actually cost to maintain, and in the case of mandatory alignment, implement these assets, make these new habitats happen? And how do the costs then compare to the benefits over time? So the protocol basically sets out that we should do this. Oops. I'm going to skip that slide mostly because Sam has basically already covered it. But I guess the one thing I wanted to point out is that with natural capital accounting, what we can quantify decreases from basically left to right, if you look at the graph on the right. So as we go along defining the assets, ecosystem services, benefits, and then trying to value them, we can do less and less effectively, as I'll point out later on in the presentation. So our task 0 almost was to develop scenarios, because with natural capital accounting, we have a period that we assess. In our case, a decision was made to go for 60 years, sometimes it's 100 years. So that means we need to actually forecast what we think will happen. So if with the baseline, what would have happened if LORP hadn't happened, we need to forecast what would have happened in 30 years' time, in 60 years' time. Would the situation as it was 5 years ago before LORP properly started have just continued, or would there have been change? And in consultation with our steering group, basically, it was decided that we should assume that an unmanaged realignment would happen. We decided on in 15 years' time. As Sam has pointed out earlier, in 2018, there almost was a breach. So we could have assumed that to have happened sooner, but we had to make an assumption, and that's the one we agreed on initially. That's the one we agreed on eventually with the steering group, basically. Then the other key assumption, and there were many other small assumptions, was that the cricket club would stop operating about 5 years in, and that assumption was arrived at in consultation with cricket club members. And we also assumed that some adaptation actions would be taken, and the ones we basically assumed that would be undertaken proactively, even before the breach would happen, was the major sewer which runs through the valley would be realigned and made tidal inundation proof, and also that the landfill would be capped and made safe. And then in terms of reactive action, we also assumed that an attempt would be made to basically reconnect the southwest coast path, not the road, but to basically make, the crossing of the valley by foot possible again. And then our second scenario is obviously LORP, and Sam has already very usefully summarized the key elements of LORP, which can also be seen on the poster, which I put on the slide. So our proper tasks in terms of the natural capital accounting we split that into 6 tasks. By the way, I'm not expecting you to be able to read the table that's on this slide. But first of all, we needed to define the study area. In our case, we decided to go for 2 study areas effectively, an inside and an outside study area. So the study area really needs to define the site and anything immediately adjacent that could be affected by change during the accounting period. So in this case, we expanded the study area to include the new site for the cricket club. And also in the north, we went as far north as we thought potentially sea level rise might affect the valley going forward. And we were conservative with that. It might not go that far. We didn't model it. So we just used our sort of best estimate. And then we had to scope the assets. So what could be affected by change now and in the future? Obviously, key of that is all the habitats that are currently in the valley and that we're expecting to develop. But also, species, fish, birds, cows, the livestock that's currently grazing or used to graze in the valley. Then we had to determine the extent. And because we have a 60-year accounting period, so we had to forecast it into the future. So we had a relatively easy job of defining the current extent, even though we had a slightly different study area to what was used for the amount statement. So we basically had to redo all the calculations. But then forecasting how the intertidal habitats might develop and what exact habitats might develop due to the unmanaged breach even, sorry. That was all informed by our knowledge of managed realignments and just sort of expert judgment. We made the best judgments that we could, and then sort of did a dynamic forecast that's not just restricted to those time steps that are included in that table. So it goes, smoothly over the years. And we created a couple of maps for our report that show what we've currently got within our study areas and then what's expected with LORP, at least initially, because obviously intertidal habitats, as I'm sure a lot of you know, are dynamic habitats, so they are forever changing, especially with sea level rise. So we knew from the modeling, and Sam already showed you a slightly different colored map of that earlier, what habitats are anticipated initially. But, well, first of all, initially you get mostly mud, and then it takes up to sort of 5 years for salt marsh plants to come in over this sort of areas that are of the right elevations for that, and then even longer for sort of full species diversity potentially. And then you get accretion, so sediment comes in and your elevations increase over the mudflats. So some of the mudflats areas will transition into salt marsh as well over time. And then you have the sea level rise adaptation zone effectively as well, where salt marsh will move in where there's currently grassland. So we had to forecast all that, and we did as best we could. Sorry. Next slide. There you go. Then we had to determine asset condition, because an asset that's not in a good condition can't fulfill all its services. That is a bit tricky. There's not all that much information out there on that often. We use things like WFD monitoring, triple I condition assessments, and stuff that was available for the terrestrial side of things. Then another key element is to determine the costs. So how much does it cost Clinton Devon Estate at the moment to maintain, manage the land? How much does it cost the council to maintain the crest level footpaths? And how much will it cost going forward to undertake LAWB? And how much might it cost if there was an unmanaged realignment? So that was all, not all that easy. Some people found it quite difficult to provide us with costs. So we had to make some assumptions as well. And then finally, it was about determining and where possible value and monetize the ecosystem services stroke benefits. And so LAWB largely creates intertidal habitats, mudflats and salt marshes. And for salt marshes and mudflats, we know that they fulfill quite a lot of ecosystem services, which are summarized on this lovely graphic, which was in the Salt Marsh Creation Handbook. But we had to decide which ones of those actually sort of apply to LAWB, not all of them, I can tell you, and which ones can we actually monetize. So again, not all of them. I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a moment. But again, I'm not expecting you to be able to read all of this. This is basically the results table for the stuff we monetize, the ecosystem services benefits we managed to monetize. And this table shows you the change between the baseline and LAWB and the direction of change as well on the right. I've got some slides on carbon, recreation and physical health, but briefly, so we monetized 8 different services, and the big sort of headline result is that we expect LAWB to have a net benefit when compared to the baseline situation. And our calculations say it's at least sort of 11.2 million over the 60-year accounting period. We call that PV60, present value 60. Obviously, there are some losses, which are basically the numbers in red with brackets. So animals rich for nutrition, there's dairy, cow grazing mainly. So that will largely be lost, although in our study area, we have some grassland in the north that sort of stays. And that will lead to effectively over the 60 years losses of just over 1.6 million. Another sort of notable loss is the one-off woodland scrub losses. So with LAWB, there is a net gain in woodland and scrub areas, but first of all, we couldn't include all of that in our assessment because we've only included areas, polygons basically, and not line features. So there is some of the net gain is missing, but even despite that, we have a net gain in our accounting, but it just takes, in our calculations, it takes more than 60 years for basically the new woodland to take on as much carbon as was basically lost when it was cut down, especially the woodland over the landfill. That was quite a big area, even though that was monoculture and not that great in carbon terms. Yeah, that doesn't matter so much. We've also reassessed mediation of waste, phosphorus removal. So there's a big benefit inside. There's a little bit of a loss outside because there's basically a change from salt marsh to mudflat, a small one, but that was notable then in the P removals. We didn't value nitrogen removal because for a benefit to be realized, there has to be a problem, and we didn't perceive, according to the WFD monitoring, there doesn't seem to be an issue with nitrogen, but there is one with phosphorus in the otter. Air pollution, not all that much, and I'll go into recreation and physical health in a minute. So we valued 8, but we should point out we couldn't value a heck of a lot of potential benefits, and that's for various reasons, including that there weren't any study for value transfer, and I should point out we value transferred, so we didn't undertake any, that wasn't in our scope to undertake any sort of primary research like willingness to pay studies. So we had to go where people had done studies before and then try and apply that to the otter. Then there's always a risk of double counting with these kind of valuations. So where there was a risk, we steered clear as well. And also some things are just not that material for the otter. For example, salt marshes attenuate wave energy. It's a well-known and quite important at certain sites benefit. But because the otter is sheltered by the beach, and there isn't that much of a fetch, it just wasn't considered that material for, in this particular case. Stuff we would have loved to have valued, but couldn't really, is this sort of full scale of the biodiversity improvements. You're getting net gain. That isn't really properly functioning yet. There isn't really a market yet, even though that's coming. We also couldn't take account of the fact that with implementing LORP, you're allowing, yes, you're losing some terrestrial habitats, but you're allowing as much adaptation as possible. There's a lot of mitigation going on. There's a lot of additional planting of habitat. There's transplanting of orchids. All that is something we couldn't really value. And there's also some partial monetization going on with the water quality and the fish being valued to some extent. But on fish, we could only really value the bass sort of benefits to the bass commercial fishery. So that's quite a tiny amount. We would have loved to have done more, but again, there's just not the studies. Another thing that we thought would probably be valued quite highly if we could, we worked quite a lot, it would be the sort of mental health benefits from the passive enjoyment of nature, but again, there just weren't the studies. So what could we value? A really big benefit that came out of it was in relation to recreation. And for that, we used Orwell, which is an existing tool, an excellent tool by the University of Exeter, which is based on sort of really regular mini surveys. Sorry, that stands for the Monitor of Engagement with the Natural Environment. And it allows you to basically select, to determine levels of visitation by selecting access points, which are the blue ones in the image. And that helped us determine that at the moment, there's just over 100,000 visitors already. So it's a well-loved site already. And that actually tallies quite well with counters that Clinton Devon have recently installed and the data we're getting from that. Now, then we had to make assumptions. So for the baseline, we actually, because we assume only the Southwest Coast path is reconnected and the other paths are lost, basically. So we just switched those off, and that led to a sort of 40% loss of visitation to the site. Now, they might have gone elsewhere, and then that benefit might be elsewhere, but we had to make some assumptions. So we assumed it was lost. For LORP, we assumed a 10% uptick. Now, that was based on some questions from the surveys we've done. There were some targeted questions on that, especially to help us with this. But also we know from other existing minor tree alignment sites that there is generally an uptick in visitors. It depends a bit on the location and the circumstance. And there's generally also an uptick of visitors during the overwintering bird season, i.e. winter, which is basically what we're expecting to have an increase of in terms of wildlife going forward post-breach. So we used 10%. And that led us to a valuation of 10.2 million for the baseline. So already worth quite a lot, this recreational benefit. And for LORP, 14.4 million. Then we also assessed the physical health benefits, and that was assessed actually for two elements. First of all, general physical health, and there's some research and studies out there. Again, this is all FTech that found those studies and determined what we should use. So basically that says just over 50% of recreation trips are active enough to provide a health benefit, and then that provides a benefit to society, i.e. saves the NHS costs, health costs. So it was determined from the literature that one active visit is worth 3.3 3.5, and then again we assumed an uptick of 10% with LORB and a down a reduction with the baseline scenario, and that led us to almost 4 million. No, what did I do? Yeah, 3.8 million, almost 4 million for the baseline and 5.3 million for LORB. Then the other physical health benefit is the cricket club. So how much is that worth? That was a really interesting one to work out. So we consulted with the cricket club. There's 450 active players there at the moment. Not all of them are members. There's a local league basically. So actively played, but the active players, there's 450. So there is an obvious societal benefit of sporting participation in addition to obviously the sort of personal benefits. And those benefits can be calculated in all sorts of different ways, but FTech decided on calculating it on the basis of investment in sport, and basically the cricket club told us how much it costs basically to make that club happen. And there was a multiplier applied, and that led to 170,000 pounds per annum being applied, with the baseline that was only applied for the first 5 years, and then LORB throughout for the 60 years, because LORB guarantees effectively the continuation of the cricket club. I should point out, we just assumed that what we have at the moment continues. There will obviously be changes, and we couldn't assess the sort of additional income streams that are expected, because from the new facilities, from the better clubhouse, from the fact that they won't be flooded out to some extent every winter, they'll be able to host cricket, county level cricket, as far as I've been told. So all those benefits of the new facilities we weren't really able to include. So this is just in inverted commas what has already been going on. Yeah, and it's an immense benefit. And then we also valued carbon. So we calculated that for the existing and the expected future habitats, and also livestock, i.e. how much the cows fart and burp. And for each habitat, there was a different sort of value of CO2 equivalent per unit. Am I going to? Sorry. And I should point out, for the intertidal habitats, i.e. the mudflats and the salt marshes, we actually assumed higher carbon sequestration, carbon burial rates for the first 20 years, because we know from existing managed realignment sites that during the first few years after breaching, particularly the first 5 to 10 years, there's really quite rapid accretion, and that buries carbon. For example, there's some graphs I included from Polholm Strace realignment, which is up on the Humber, which is based on LiDAR analysis, which just sort of demonstrates how accretion can be quite rapid, and especially over the lower lying, the mudflats, which are inundated more frequently than the salt marsh areas, which is on the sort of east or southeast for Polholm Strace. Should point out, do not expect those accretion rates if you can read those graphs that have occurred at Paul on the Otter, because the turbidity in the Humber is much higher than what we think is happening in the Otter. Anyway, so we had to come up with assumptions of what we think will happen on the intertidal, not just in terms of habitat, but also how much accretion do we expect, and then we translated that into anticipated carbon barrier rates based on our own experience, and also some research that was done by Manchester University. And all those calculations lead us to the conclusion that much more carbon will be sequestered due to LORB than during the baseline, and also then what is lost with the woodlands and etc. So the realignment itself, we estimate, will sequester almost 30,000 tons of CO2 equivalent over the 60 years, which is equivalent to about 300 cars a year if you average it out. So, yeah, I could go on, but what have we learned? First of all, in terms of if other people want to do something like that, would we recommend it? Absolutely, because natural capital accounting is incredibly helpful in identifying the many, many benefits and the significant benefits of coastal restoration projects. Be prepared to have to do more work for the baseline to just determine your existing habitats and also your forecasting than maybe you think, because you probably will have a slightly different study area to the environment statement and existing surveys, which will be invaluable, but likely not enough. And be prepared to make many, many, many assumptions, so many assumptions. And they need to be, as much as you can, developed in consultation with stakeholders early on, probably earlier than we did, to be fair, for some of them. But within reason, at some point you will have to draw the line, because not everyone will agree with all the assumptions that you make. So do your best, but then at some point you say, okay, fine, that's signed off. We take that now and we run with it. And run with it with an environmental economist. Do not try to do this if you don't have an economist on board. You do need economists on board for this kind of quantitative assessment. Benefit cost calculations can be tricky. You might have noticed that I've not actually presented on a comparison of the benefits to cost, because basically we're still not quite finished with that. So watch this space for that one. But ultimately, we've proven that there are clear net ecosystem services benefits with LORB, even though we haven't been able to assess all the benefits, and some of which we think are key. I should also point out that the Lower Otter is actually quite unusual. It's the differential, i.e. the sort of benefits when compared to the baseline, we would expect to be higher with most managed realignments, which are often located in more rural areas where you don't have as much visitation and recreational and physical health benefits as you have already in the Lower Otter, because we're in basically next to a major town and in a well-loved location with the Southwest Coast Path running through. So often you go from almost no visitors to 20 to 30,000 visitors a year, whereas here we already have about 100,000. And then, yeah, we would always recommend more primary research, that definitely to help us assess more services, maybe do some willingness to pay surveys for some of the elements. Yeah. Thank you very much. I should point out, yeah, thank you very much to everyone who helped with this. So the steering group, the Environment Agency, Clinton Devon Estates, obviously FTech couldn't have done it without Rob and Ian, and all the lovely people who answered the surveys. And I think we had almost 800 people doing it over the 2 years. So amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, both Susie and Roger, for your very sort of detailed explanations of the work that you've been doing. One of the interesting things in terms of valuations, of course, there are synergies with our respective projects with other schemes. So, for example, the Lower Otter project has a role in actually providing compensatory habitat for flood defence works that have been done on the ex-estuary.
Thanks, Sam. I totally forgot to say that.
Do we want to mention the next
Yes.
final workshop? We do.
Yeah, thanks. The segue was nearly there. Yes, so mentioning our French partners, obviously Régis is here. We've had Camille on the line from CDL SMLN in France, and the baton is handed to them for the final 4th cross-border webinar, which will be held in January on the 18th. With the title of Coastal Change and Reconfiguration of Space, Using Biodiversity to Restore Coastal Habitats. So lessons learned from the Saâne Valley in France and the Otter Valley, the Lower Otter Valley in England. The link for that and the invitation that you can use to book yourself in should be out in the next 12 or so days. So look out for that one. And we very much look forward to welcoming you to that final final webinar in the new year. So thank you ever so much for all of your participation, and we'll see you soon. If the team would like to stay on, that would be lovely. Thank you and goodbye.